fear struck Constable Edgar Millen as he crouched low behind a snowbank, his gloved hands trembling. He could feel his heart pounding and his ears ringing. As he grabbed his Winchester .30-06 rifle, nothing could have prepared him for what was about to happen. The harsh Arctic winter of 1932 brought with it freezing cold temperatures and the impossible manhunt for Albert Johnson, the fugitive who they had chased 150 miles across the most brutal wilderness, and now he was finally in sight. Constable Millen was aware that this man was defiant and just days before had purchased enough ammunition to set off the alarm bells of every police detachment in the area. Just weeks before, the police had tangled with him at his remote trapping cabin, where he fortified it almost like it was a bunker. In this exchange of fire, one officer was injured. The police even had to resort to using dynamite to blow up Johnson's cabin with him inside of it. Unbelievably, Johnson would survive the explosion, and that would set off one of the largest manhunts in Canadian history. Millen knew they were outmatched. This wasn't just a standoff. This is a battle against a man who turned the wilderness into a weapon. Johnson would go on to be aptly named the Mad Trapper of Rat River. This story is intense. We're talking shootouts, wilderness survival, full of twists and turns. With that, let's move on. Constable Edgar Millen was born in Ireland in 1901, an Irish immigrant who came to Canada with his family in 1907. He joined the Royal Canadian Mounted Police on November 22, 1920. He was only 19 years old at the age he became a police officer. He was assigned badge number 9669. Over the next decade, Millen built a reputation as a dedicated and capable officer, known for his resilience and commitment to duty. His assignments took him to some of the most remote and challenging regions in northern Canada. Here, he became well acquainted with the harsh realities of policing in the Yukon and Northwest Territories during the 1930s. In particular, officers like Millen faced vast, treacherous landscapes characterized by dense forests, rugged mountain, and frozen rivers. The extreme cold was relentless, temperatures often plunging well below 40 degrees Celsius, creating a perilous setting where frostbite and hypothermia were constant threats. Not to mention how the isolation compounded all of these challenges. Because of this, there's not a lot of communication with RCMP headquarters, and backup could be days or weeks away. And in this unforgiving terrain, RCMP officers were not only enforcers of the law, but also survivalists, having to rely on their wits and endurance to navigate the wilderness. An interesting thing is that these areas still to this day are so remote that officers working in these remote environments still are put in a situation where they're not able to access other law enforcement backup for days at a time. Things would change for Millen in July of 1931 when a stranger arrives at Fort McPherson, a small community in the Northwest Territories. The man identifies himself as Albert Johnson, and he was noted for having a Scandinavian accent and a very reserved demeanor. Johnson goes into some of the local suppliers with substantial amounts of money and starts buying up enough ammunition to essentially supply an army. He comes in with rolls of $20 bills, which obviously raises eyes with the locals, and he spends upwards of like the equivalent of today's money of $20,000, $30,000 in ammunition and weapons. So right away, this sets off alarm bells, and the RCMP or the police are notified. Now, Millen is assigned to what's called the Arctic Red River Detachment, and from here he's dispatched over to Fort McPherson. Now, Constable Millen is able to find Johnson and he starts to question him, but he receives little to no information about him. Johnson essentially is super reticent to provide any details about his backgrounds or intentions and just keeps asserting that he's mounting an expedition by himself. Though Millen's quite adamant that this terrain is too harsh, you can't go out there without help, you need to hire a guide and hire locals, but Johnson is pretty much go pound salt and leave me alone. Now, after this interaction, there's not a lot that Millen can do, and Johnson essentially just leaves and heads back into the wilderness, where he begins to construct a small cabin in the Rat River area. The Rat River is a remote area of the Northwest Territories located west of the Yukon and east of the Mackenzie Rivers. Now, his reclusive behavior and lack of a trapping license was a concern for Millen. Now, he even suggested to Johnson at one point during the conversation that, hey, you should go get your permits to make sure you're all legal. Now, time would go by, and Johnson fails to get a trapping license, but he still continued to build his cabin and essentially on what was considered a trap line. Now, trap line is a system that's common in Canada where different trappers are assigned a tract of land that they're responsible to trap or manage for the fur-bearing species. But in this case, Johnson wouldn't have been able to legally trap in that area. As time went on, reports started to surface as somebody tampering with other trappers' lines and equipment. And this right away led the police to start looking at Johnson. These incidents set the stage for a series of confrontation between Johnson and the RCMP, where Constable Millen played the central contacting officer role. And each interaction, it was said that essentially Johnson was just straight up uncooperative. Didn't want to basically divulge a lot of information, but not enough essentially to get him arrested at the time. That is until December of 1931. Local trappers in the Rat River area have consistently complained about the guy being a trap line bully and were reporting series of unsettling incidents. What they ended up finding was traps were sprung and hung on trees, which was a deliberate act of sabotage that disrupted people's livelihoods. What that means is that most of the traps that are at that time that are set are spring-loaded traps that would catch, say, pine marten going up and down the trees, or fishers, different types of weasels, or you might have spring-loaded traps in the water. And if you essentially disarm it by sticking a stick in it, it will be completely useless. And it's a good way to sabotage someone else's trap line so you can maybe get those animals. It's not a nice thing to do. It's been illegal in Canada for at least 100 years that I can think of. But it's enough at this point for the police to confront Johnson and figure out exactly what's going on. So concerned by these reports, Edgar Millen is dispatched along with Alfred King and Special Constable Joe Bernard to investigate these complaints. They're going to go confront Johnson at his cabin. So Johnson's cabin was described as a rough but sturdy structure built mostly from spruce logs and buried partially in the deep snow. Now, the journey through the harsh winter landscape would take them about 2 days, and the temperatures were said to be about minus 30 degrees Celsius. So the men actually had to travel through Christmas, and they end up arriving at his cabin on December 26, 1931. When they get there, they can see smoke rising from the cabin's chimney, clear sign that Johnson was either inside or had been there within the last day. The cabin itself seemed to blend into the landscape. It was small, it had frosted windows that were dark and uninviting. The surrounding trees cast long shadows over the clearing. As they approached the cabin itself, they noticed it was deliberately fortified. The logs were tightly interlocked and small windows offered no view inside. It was less of a home and more of a bunker. King and Bernard knocked repeatedly, calling for Johnson to come out, but there was no answer. They circled the cabin and peered through every one of the small windows. Finally, they catch a glimpse of Johnson. He sat there, motionless, his expression unreadable, his rifle resting with the arm's reach. Officers shouted again, but Johnson wouldn't move. He wouldn't even look at them. The silence was so unnerving that after several minutes of fruitless communication, King had no choice but to return to Klavik and report their findings and essentially try and get backup. There was enough about this situation to give those officers more than enough pause to try and either break down the door or engage this guy any further, and then he knew it was time to hightail out of there. So they contact Millen, who contacts his inspector, Eames, and through him they get together a search warrant. And they take a larger team back to Johnson's cabin on December 31st, 1931. This time, the group was led by Constables King, McDowell, and Special Constables Bernard and Lazarus Diccinelli. Together, they approached the cabin. The officers, all thrown off by its fortified design. The walls were reinforced, and the structure's placement in the clearing provided Johnson with kind of a clear 360-degree view of any approach. It was clear he prepared for an encounter. When they presented the search warrant and demanded entry, Johnson again refused to respond. The officers, now wary of his intent, surrounded the cabin. As Constable King moved to force the door open, a sudden gunshot cracked the cold silence. The bullet struck King in the chest. He fell to the snow, blood staining white landscape. The officers scramble for cover as more shots begin to erupt from the cabin. Johnson's fortified position allowed him to fire at the officers with impunity, while the officers struggled to essentially get to cover because of the deep snow. The firefight was brief but intense. On several occasions, the officers are able to return fire, but it didn't appear that they were able to hit Johnson. Being completely unable to breach the cabin and with King critically wounded, the officers were forced to retreat. They grabbed King and carried him all the way back to a Aklavik for medical attention, leaving Johnson alone once more in his cabin. It said that the men were able to make the 2-day journey in less than half the time to get him out of there in time and into a doctor. He does survive this wound. It was said that the bullet missed King's heart and lungs by like mere centimeters. Now, this violent confrontation clearly marked a turning point. This was no longer a case about an obstinate man who didn't want to talk to the police about vandalized traps and things like that. This guy was clearly somebody dangerous and clearly somebody that had no problem shooting at the police. Once word makes it back to Inspector Eames, a full-scale manhunt is already being planned. The lengths that Johnson had already gone to and was about to go to is insane. It reminds me also of the story of the Killdozer guy in the United States, but this guy had a problem with authority and he was going to let everybody know it. So following that confrontation, on January 9th, 1932, RCMP began to launch a calculated effort to apprehend Johnson. Under the command of Inspector Eames, the team set out from Aklavik, braving the unforgiving Arctic winter. Millen doesn't go with this group to Johnson's cabin, rather he stays behind to play more of a support role this time. So on this trip, 9 police officers would go, including McDowell, Bernard, Stitchinelli, and a few more officers. With them, they brought camping supplies, 42 sled dogs, and enough food and water to last them until Johnson was apprehended. It was 60 miles through snowdrifts and minus 40 temperatures just to reach the cabin. The team arrives at the cabin late on January 10th and immediately starts to set about surrounding the structure. Smoke was said to be rising from the chimney, a sure sign that Johnson was nearby. Before their arrival at this point, the cabin itself had actually been reinforced with packed snow, making it even harder to get into. So the officers, again, shout at Johnson to come out. Again, there's no response from Johnson. There's zero acknowledgement of the police officer's presence. And now, for hours, the RCMP would attempt to engage him. And the bitter night kept dragging on. And just as dangerous as Johnson was the weather. At nearly minus 40 degrees, they were starting to suffer hypothermia. And they couldn't exactly make their presence known, so they were having to be out there without a fire and without proper tents at times. Now, the team had brought with them 20 pounds of packed dynamite. And by the morning of January 11th, nearly 15 hours after they arrive, a decision is made to escalate. They were able to place 20 pounds against the walls of Johnson's cabin by slowly sneaking up to it just out of his sight line. After the dynamite is laid, the men make it back to cover. The explosion rocked the clearing, sending debris flying high into the frosty air. When the dust and snow settled, the cabin was reduced to rubble, with only one single wall standing. The team prepared to approach, believing either Johnson was dead or incapacitated. But Johnson was not an ordinary man. From beneath the debris, he emerges with a rifle in hand, covered in soot and snow. He had dug a trench, believe it or not, beneath the cabin floor that shielded him from the explosion. Without hesitation, he begins to open fire on the officers. It said the firefight was short but intense. Johnson's fortified position again gave him the ability to pin down the officers until he was able to retreat. In the chaos, they lose sight of Johnson and they have to regroup about a mile down the trail from his cabin. It's here that they are able to get a plan and go back and look, and this is when they realize that Johnson vanished from the cabin, completely vanished out of their sight, and essentially left behind no tracks. So they were super confused. There's no trace of this guy. It had taken them 2 days to reach Johnson's cabin, but in less than 24 hours, effort to capture them ended in complete failure. The journey back to Aklavik was heavy with frustration and fear. They didn't know if Johnson was going to hunt them. They had no idea where he was. Johnson had proven himself not only be just a fugitive, but a master of survival and evasion. For Constable Edgar Millen, this was a personal turning point. As he joined the manhunt in the days that followed, he knew they were up against more than just a criminal. They were chasing a man who seemed almost unstoppable. And in the face of overwhelming odds, Millen was determined to get his man. As Constable King is recovering in the hospital in a clavic, Edgar Millen is placed in charge of the next operation the RCMP would carry out. They were to go back to Johnson's cabin, try to pick up his trail, and essentially hunt him down. And Millen took charge, coordinating this next phase with precision. The men rested briefly, knowing that any delay gave Johnson valuable time to reinforce either his position or disappear even deeper into the wilderness. And by early January, a larger, better prepared team set out once again to Johnson's cabin, braving temperatures that were dropping below minus 40 degrees. This journey was grueling. We're talking snowdrifts that slowed the sled dogs down, biting winds, frostbite, and also knowing that there's a mad trapper out there trying to kill you. So couldn't imagine this was a very fun time for these guys. So when they arrived back to Johnson's cabin, they started again to look for any sign of where he may have went during the initial encounter. They're unable to pick up his trail right away, but eventually with enough effort, they're able to pick up a snowshoe track. Now, it said Johnson's trail was super erratic, and it seemed at times that he was trying to deliberately lead the men astray. His survival skills bordered on superhuman as he navigated this icy terrain with precision, often using caribou trails to obscure his footprints. It's even said at one point they observed he had actually put his snowshoes on backwards to confuse the officers that were tracking him. The RCMP followed his tracks for miles, only to discover in spots he would double back, silently watching them from above as if he was toying with his very pursuers. He was always one step ahead of the officers. For Millen and his men, this chase became a test of both endurance and willpower. The relentless cold and deep snow hampered them at every turn, frost forming on their faces and freezing their breath in midair. Nights were spent hastily in built snow shelters or canvas tents reinforced against the wind. Their food supplies dwindled as they rationed pemmican and hardtack to maintain their strength. In these temperatures, expect that you're probably taking up between 10 to 20,000 calories a day just to keep yourself alive. Unbelievably, to the officers though, Johnson seemed to move through this crazy and difficult terrain as if it was nothing, especially considering he was one person, he didn't have dogs, he didn't really have gear with him. It's like he was superhuman. The pursuit wound through maze-like channels of the Mackenzie Delta, where every bend in the river began to look the same. The frozen Aklavik flats were treacherous, with thin ice threatening to crack beneath their sleds. Beyond the flats lay the Richardson Mountains, where steep inclines and avalanches made it almost impossible to cross, especially by yourself. Every step forward seemed to bring with it new dangers for the officers, but also the same perplexing reality. Like, how could Johnson make it through this on his own? Now, the RCMP was definitely accustomed to enduring these harsh northern winters. At night, they did try to set up camp wherever terrain allowed, often constructing snow shelters or using canvas tents. Inside the tents, they would use small kerosene heaters and stoves to provide just enough warmth, basically keep them alive. The men wrapped themselves in fur-lined parkers, mittens, and thick woolen layers. Mealtimes were sparse but essential. Supplies that they would carry were things like pemmican and hardtack and tins of preserved meat. So this is another important point to note. Like, Johnson's trekking, like, the RCMP officers with dogs can barely keep up to this guy, and Johnson isn't able to stop and hunt for himself. So, like, how is he getting food? These guys are packed up with supplies and all of these things and using dogs to get around. This guy's just out here snowshoeing it with like little to no gear, and somehow they can't even keep up with them. It's just wild. The one thing the police officers began to notice is that there was no clear destination that they could put Johnson going to. They just know he was heading towards the Canadian-Alaskan border, towards someplace called Eagle River. But weeks would drag on. Officers just couldn't seem to close that distance. At every turn, even when they tried to split up to follow his trail, Johnson was able to put down fake tracks and fake trails to lead the groups of different officers to essentially find each other. It's crazy how much this guy was playing everybody involved. And again, just to reiterate, it was said that during several times during the manhunt, he was actually seen taunting the officers. But after weeks of unsuccessful attempts, the RCMP knew they needed to do something different. Something nobody had tried on a police chase before in Canada. Enter Wap May, one of Canada's most skilled bush pilots, who happened to be one of the last known pilots to encounter the ace of World War II, von Richthofen, the Red Baron. He was flying a bright orange Blanca monoplane. May brought a technological advantage that shifted the dynamics of the manhunt. Though limited to weather and terrain and a few hours of flight a day, May's aerial reconnaissance provided critical intelligence to the officers on the ground. Despite May's involvement, though, the mad trapper still somehow continued to elude capture. At one point, his trail led through the place called Porcupine River, where this dense forest and icy conditions completely slowed down the RCMP sled teams to pretty much a crawl. And also, the tree cover protected him from the airplane seeing him above. Johnson continued to move like a ghost, using the terrain to his advantage. His evasion tactics became legendary, using false trails, sudden disappearances, and even at one point, he reaches this sheer face of the cliff and is said to ascend almost 2 kilometers, nearly vertical, over a mountain in a place where nobody had made that climb solo before. It had been only a place that you needed a team to get through. Wild. Anyhow, the toll on Millen's team was intense. They started to run out of supplies as the chase extended far beyond what they planned. The sled dogs were beginning to grow weaker with every mile. Could they actually catch a man who seemed more like a spirit than a human? Every failure began to chip away at the group's morale, but Millen refused to give up. Because this wasn't just a manhunt, it was a battle for survival. Because if he slipped through their grips, who knew who else Albert Johnson would kill? By January 30, 1932, the manhunt had become a grueling epic stretching over weeks of bitter cold and treacherous terrain. Millen and his team were able to pick up one of Johnson's fresh footprints, and they start following it for what would become about 24 hours. They're cutting through the deep snow along the Eagle River. Again, this path is erratic and weaving, and it doesn't make a lot of sense. At one point, one of the officers notes, "It seems like Johnson's trying to lead us into a trap." They were exhausted. Each mile felt longer than the last. Their sled dogs were at their end. The team paused in a clearing. Millen scanned the landscape with his binoculars. Everything was eerily silent. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring, suffocates even the sound of your own breathing. Ahead, nestled against a jagged cliff face, was a dense tangle of brush, a natural hiding spot. Millen gestured for his men to fan out, rifles ready. As they moved forward, the snow beneath the boots crunched with a sound that felt as deafening as the stillness. Then it came, a single gunshot, sharp and deliberate. Millen staggered back, clutching his chest. The bullet had pierced through his parka and struck his heart. You could see the almost neon pink blood sitting on the surface of the snow, frozen. It looked like foam. And Millen collapsed. The world stopped. His men froze, their shock giving away to instinct as they scrambled for cover. The forest erupted with return fire, bullets cracking against the cliffside and burying themselves in snow. But Johnson had chosen his position, him near total cover, as he fired with precision, keeping all of the RCMP officers pinned down. Millen's men could only watch helplessly as their leader lay motionless in the snow. For weeks, he had been their anchor, the one who kept him going through cold and despair. Now he was gone. The weight of his death hung heavy, not just as a personal loss, but as a grim reminder of who they were up against. The firefight continued briefly. The team scrambled to regroup, and by the time they did, Johnson was gone. Once again, vanished into the wilderness, leaving only empty shell casings and faint tracks in the snow. The men did everything they could to retrieve Millen's body. Millen's death was almost instantaneous. The bullet had passed through his heart and lungs, causing massive and instant blood loss. The firefight that claimed his life was brief yet devastating. But with Johnson gone again, the men had to regroup. But their first priority was securing Millen's body so that it could be taken out when it was safe to do so. Said that they remained at the site guarding his body until they could come up with a plan. Reports actually suggest that Johnson at this point began to toy with his pursuers in the aftermath of Millen's death. When the men went to go pack up camp, they discovered tracks around the site which indicated Johnson had actually circled back after the firefight and was observing the officers essentially packing up Millen's body. This audacious act was a chilling reminder of Johnson's calculated defiance and his clear psychological disturbance. The men eventually began the somber task of carrying Millen's body back through the treacherous terrain to a clavic. This journey was slow and arduous, with the frigid and heavy air full of grief. Every step was a stark reminder of the cost of the pursuit and also of the toll it had taken on their bodies. Back in a clavic, news of Millen's death spread quickly. The manhunt for Albert Johnson was no longer just a matter of justice. It had become deeply personal. And in the days that followed, Inspector Alexander Eames assumed the command of the operation. Recognizing Johnson's survival skills and intimate knowledge of the terrain, he immediately enlisted the help of Watt May again to start flying over the area to try and pick up the tracks. May scouted the snowy expanse from above, identifying also possible escape routes, and again starts providing this intelligence back to Eames. During the time when Millen's body was brought back, the RCMP did keep some people on the ground in the area that were communicating with Eames as they were doing surveillance. Now, this would go on for a few more weeks, and the manhunt for Albert Johnson finally comes to a head in mid-February 1932, 6 weeks after it began. By then, Johnson had led the RCMP and the trackers on a chase spanning over 150 miles through some of the harshest terrain in the Northwest Territories and the Yukon. With the death of Constable Edgar Millen still fresh in their minds, they press forward. On February 17th, they're able to pick up Johnson's trail near a remote area along Eagle River, close to the Yukon-Alaska border. Johnson was spotted moving through the treacherous terrain, his movements again erratic yet purposeful. The RCMP, using the information relayed by Watt May, closed in on his position. Over the preceding days, Johnson's pace had slowed significantly. He had likely begun to feel the weight of isolation, hunger, and the relentless pursuit. It was already a complete mystery to the police on the ground, like how this guy had even survived this long. This pursuit was going 24/7, and it's not like Johnson had time to stop and hunt for caribou. Now, the final standoff would occur in a narrow canyon along the Eagle River. Johnson again takes a high vantage point on a ridge, giving him a clear line of sight over the frozen river below. The RCMP surrounds the area, taking cover behind trees and snowbanks, waiting for their moment to strike Johnson. As always, though, Johnson makes the first move, and a volley of gunfire erupts from his position, his rifle cracking through the cold air. The officers begin to return fire, their bullets ricocheting off the rocks and echoing through the canyon. The firefight was intense. Johnson's survival instincts were unmatched. He moved around with precision, making it nearly impossible for the officers to pin him down. The freezing temperatures made every moment slower and every breath heavier. The battle went on for hours until one of the RCMP shots finally struck Johnson. He collapsed on the icy ground, mortally wounded. The chase that had consumed weeks of grueling effort and claimed the life of Edgar Millen was finally over. When the officers approached his body, they were struck in awe by what they found. Johnson only carried the barest essentials with him: a rifle, ammunition, and a few basic tools. He barely had any supplies, yet somehow he had survived for weeks in the unforgiving wilderness. In his backpack, they were actually able to find some squirrels and a whiskey jack, which is like a gray version of a blue jay. So essentially, he was out there just grabbing squirrels and gray jays along the way, just something that he probably could have killed with a rock if he had a good arm. Now, in his pockets, he had cash and pearls, an amount of cash that would be about $60,000 in today's value. So this guy had a lot of money. And not to mention the fact that at the start of the story, this guy had spent like $30,000 or $40,000 on ammunition and guns. So this guy was well off. And that's one of the mysteries still with this story. To this day, we don't know how or why. On his person and from that cabin, there's no documents, no clues, no letters, anything about his real identity. Even in death, Albert Johnson remained a mystery to these officers. The RCMP took Johnson back to an unmarked grave in a clavic. Even after an intense investigation by the RCMP, once they get back to civilization turns up absolutely no leads. Interviews with locals, no leads. Only thing that they have to go on is that he might have been a Scandinavian immigrant based on his accent. And over the years, numerous investigators have tried to unravel this mystery. Seriously, it boggles my brain what was going through this guy's mind to just show up in this town, essentially looking to pick a fight with the police. Was all kinds of theories started to emerge about him being a possible American outlaw, that he could have been just a Scandinavian immigrant who came to Canada based on his accent, or maybe just a mentally deranged guy who sought isolation in the vast northern wilderness. But to this day, nobody's figured it out. And there's been numerous forensic investigations and genetic testing that have yielded no usable results. Most recently in 2007, people were able to analyze his DNA and uncover that he was of Scandinavian descent, likely from Sweden, but that's it. Between the time that he was born and the time that he shows up in Rat River, there's little information on who this guy was or what other crimes he had committed. Because the one thing that I'm certain of is that this wasn't his first rodeo, but it seems like we'll never know. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on what would have caused this guy to do it and who you think he might have been. But the legacy of this mad trapper manhunt lives on in Canadian history. It was actually said to be the first real kind of on the edge of your seat radio broadcast that had people tuning in every night to see what was going on. It had the whole country on the edge of their seats. And the pursuit of Albert Johnson to this day remains a story of resilience, survival, and the relentless drive to uphold justice. I can't imagine what Millen went through in his last moments. He truly was a hero in life and not just in death. The wilderness where the chase unfolded remains much the same to this day as it did in 1932. Quiet, vast, and untamed, it holds echoes of Canada's greatest legends and the one unanswered question: who was the Mad Trapper? All right, guys, thanks for joining in this week. It's been a blast. The show could use your support. Please share this episode. Please subscribe. Please like it or drop a comment. Let us know what's up, even what kind of coffee you had this morning.